you think about it, the 1970s were a decade very much like our own. Each decade was characterized by an ongoing economic depression and slump in which the economy really didn't grow, stuff was horrible, and our foreign policy was characterized by appeasement and weakness and a tremendous partisan polarization in the country. The 70s, after Nixon was forced out of office, obviously he was succeeded by Gerald Ford, who then lost the election of '76 to Jimmy Carter, who served for one term. The Ford and the Carter presidencies were both basically conducted in the backdrop of unbelievably high inflation and high unemployment. And those normally were regarded by economists as opposites. If you had high unemployment, you couldn't have high inflation because there was no demand for goods, and why would prices rise? And if you had high inflation, you'd have to be struggling to produce enough goods that satisfy popular demand, and unemployment would have to drop, employment would have to rise. But economists did not take account of the concept that the money supply itself would be totally debased, and therefore whatever the unemployment rate was, the inflation would continue high. Really, the theme of the 1970s was set in 1971 and '72, when Nixon took America off the gold standard. And that essentially meant that the discipline of the faith in the American dollar and the monetary system was gone. And the U.S. could inflate its currency to whatever it wanted, and the rest of the world would follow because their currencies were all basically pegged to the dollar, no longer to the price of gold. And that let loose an unbelievable inflation. And when you combine that with the fact that in the Vietnam War era, Johnson and Nixon, unlike Truman in Korea, refused to raise taxes to pay for the war because they thought it would be unpopular and they wanted to get reelected and they worried about the impact of high taxes. And as a result, they ran enormous budget deficits. I looked up the other day to see if the federal debt had risen more under Obama than under any other president, and I found no. Nixon administration, it had increased more, doubling in the first 5 years of his presidency, because they just would not raise taxes and the war spending was huge. We suffered for that for the entire decade, in which inflation and unemployment just seemed without end. And then to add into it, in 1973, after Nixon took us off the gold standard, OPEC was formed. Because the Arabs said, hey, if you're going to pay us in funny money, not backed by gold, we're going to get together and control oil production and manipulate the price of oil ourselves to hold it constant in terms of gold. At the time, we thought we were being horribly ripped off by the Arabs. But when you look at the graphs over the last 40 years, oil has remained very close to the price of gold, including now when gold is dropping and oil prices are dropping. And then in 1979, we were hit by another Arab oil boycott as a result of the Iranian Revolution. And that also created a huge problem in the United States and set us on the path to energy independence, something we really couldn't achieve until fracking made it technically possible in this decade. And at the time, we had very weak presidential leadership. Neither Ford nor Carter were prepared to take the steps necessary to really rein in inflation or to really get the economy back on track, and both were really appeasers in their foreign policy. Ford signed the nuclear freeze agreements and the SALT agreements with Russia, which basically helped communism stay in business until Reagan basically forced them into an arms race that led to an implosion of their system. And Carter weakened America internationally tremendously, and that weakness was evidenced by the hostage crisis. The takeover of Iran by the Islamists really was the beginning of the war on terror, the beginning of the Islamist injection into international politics, and created an enormous headache for us that could prove to be a horrible catastrophe if Iran goes nuclear and uses one of those weapons. But struggling to be born within the Ford and the Carter years was Ronald Reagan. And that idea of a total revisiting of all of the assumptions that had led us to this situation in the 1970s. We'll talk about that in our next video. Thanks for watching.